I never thought it would happen to me, betrayed by the person I trusted most. How could I let it get this far, I asked myself, the guilt clawing at me. My life was perfect, or so I thought, but one mistake, one secret, changed everything. Now I'm left picking up the pieces. This isn't just a story about mistakes, it's about the journey of finding myself in the rubble, piecing together a life I thought was beyond repair. Stick with me, because what happened next is something I never saw coming. Before we dive in, make sure to follow along and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story too. It wasn't until the slam of the front door echoed through the house that I knew something was wrong. My heart skipped a beat, the sound startling in the quiet evening. I looked up from my phone, my breath catching as I saw my husband standing in the doorway. "Where have you been?" His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the tremble in it. "Just at the office. You know things have been crazy this week." I tried to sound casual, my fingers gripping the edge of the table as I forced a smile. He stepped further into the room, holding my phone in his hand. The screen was unlocked, a string of messages glaring back at me like a neon sign. My stomach plummeted. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice breaking. "Who is he?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, an explanation, anything to deflect the reality staring us both in the face. But there was nothing. The truth was right there in his hand. I suppose I should back up a bit, explain how we got here. It's not like I planned for this to happen. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to shatter the life we'd built together. But isn't that how these things always go? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you're standing in the rubble wondering where it all went wrong. My husband Tim is a good man, dependable, kind, loyal to a fault. He's the kind of person who triple checks every detail, who keeps a spreadsheet for everything, from our finances to what we need from the grocery store. But that meticulousness, that predictability, started to feel suffocating. I know how selfish that sounds, maybe it is, but there's something about feeling like your life is set in stone that makes you want to shatter it, just to see if you still can. I should have been content. Tim gave me everything I ever asked for, a nice home, a stable life. But there's a difference between being provided for and being seen. And I hadn't felt seen in years. Then came Jake. Jake was the kind of man you notice before he notices you. Confident, charming, and maddeningly unattainable. Or so I thought. We worked together at the same firm, and he had a way of commanding the room without saying much. His presence was magnetic, his attention addictive. It started innocently enough. Late nights at the office, shared frustrations over deadlines, inside jokes whispered during meetings. But there was an undertone to our interactions that I couldn't ignore, a crackling energy that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One night, after a particularly grueling project, we went out for drinks with the team. The bar was loud, the air thick with the scent of sweat and spilled beer. Jake leaned in close to me, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "You're incredible, you know that?" He smiled, his eyes locking onto mine. I laughed, brushing off the compliment, but the heat in his gaze lingered. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, but it was the first time I let myself believe he meant it. From there, things escalated quickly. Texts turned into late-night phone calls. Casual touches became lingering ones. And before I knew it, we were sneaking away during lunch breaks, stealing moments that felt too good to be real. I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. I was so lost in my thoughts I didn't notice Tim had moved closer. He dropped my phone onto the table, the clatter jolting me back to the present. "You're not even going to deny it, are you?" I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. I wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words felt hollow even before I spoke them. "It's not what you think," I began, but he cut me off with a bitter laugh. "Don't insult me. I saw the messages. I know everything." He paced the room, his hands running through his hair in a way I'd never seen before. Tim was always so composed, so in control. Seeing him unravel like this was like watching a stranger. "How long?" His voice cracked, and I felt the weight of the question settle in my chest. "A few months," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "A few months," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Do you have any idea what you've done? To us? To me?" I flinched at the raw pain in his words. I wanted to reach out to him to explain, but what could I possibly say? That I was bored? That I wanted more? That I didn't think about what it would cost until it was too late? That night, Tim slept on the couch. Or maybe he didn't sleep at all, I wouldn't know. I stayed in our room, staring at the ceiling as the enormity of what I'd done settled over me like a heavy blanket. The reality was, this wasn't just about Tim. This was about everything I'd risked, everything I'd thrown away for a few stolen moments of excitement. I knew the fallout would come, but I wasn't ready for it. How could I be? When you make choices like this, you convince yourself you'll deal with the consequences later, but later always comes too soon. The following morning, the house was eerily quiet. Tim was already gone, the couch neatly arranged as though he hadn't slept there at all. A note sat on the counter next to his favorite coffee mug. "We need to talk tonight." The words were scrawled in his meticulous handwriting, the letters small and precise. My stomach churned as I stared at the note, the weight of the impending conversation pressing down on me. I knew this wasn't something we could ignore or sweep under the rug. Not this time. I spent the day in a haze, replaying everything in my mind, the choices I'd made, the moments that led to this, and yet there was still a part of me, a small, selfish part, that longed for Jake, for the rush of his attention, the way he made me feel alive. That part of me whispered that I hadn't been wrong to seek something more, even if the cost was everything. When Tim walked through the door that evening, the tension was palpable. He didn't look at me as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were bracing himself. "Let's just get this over with," he said, his voice flat. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals, celebrated birthdays, planned our lives. It felt foreign now, like a battlefield. "I want to understand," he began, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Why? Was I not enough?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I tell him that it wasn't about him, but about me, about my own restlessness, my own shortcomings? "It's not that," I said finally. "It's complicated." "Complicated," he scoffed, his voice rising. "You've destroyed our marriage, and all you can say is that it's complicated?" I flinched at his words, the truth of them cutting deep. He was right. I had destroyed our marriage, and for what? A fleeting connection, a momentary escape? I was lonely, I admitted, my voice trembling. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. He stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. "Invisible? I've done everything for you. Everything. How could you not see that?" "I know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I know you have, and I'm so sorry." But it wasn't enough. For the first time, Tim's composure cracked. He slammed his hands on the table, his voice shaking with anger. "Not enough? What more could I have done? Tell me, because I don't understand." I didn't have an answer for him. I couldn't even begin to articulate the emptiness I'd felt, the craving for something more. All I knew was that I'd made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. Tim stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. "You love him?" he asked suddenly, his back to me. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me, his expression a mix of devastation and fury. You don't know? You don't know? You've risked everything and you can't even answer that? The conversation ended with him walking out of the room, leaving me alone with my guilt. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, the reality of what I'd done sinking in deeper with each passing moment. I knew I'd hurt him in a way that couldn't be undone, and the thought of it was almost unbearable. But even in the midst of my regret, there was still a part of me that clung to Jake. A part of me that wondered if things could have been different, if I could have had both. The stability of my marriage and the passion of my affair. It was a dangerous thought, one that I knew I couldn't entertain. But it was there, lurking in the back of my mind. A few days later, I received text from Jake. Hey, everything okay? I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It was the first time I'd heard from him since everything had come to light. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to cut ties completely. But another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, needed to hear his voice. Not really, I replied. Can we talk? He called me almost immediately, his voice warm and reassuring. What's going on? You sound upset. Tim found out, I admitted, my voice shaking. He knows about us. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching uncomfortably. And what does that mean for us? He asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know what to do. Jake sighed, his tone shifting. Look, I care about you, but I can't get involved in this. You need to figure out your marriage first. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For all his charm, all his promises, he was backing away the moment things got difficult. I thought you cared, I said, my voice cracking. I do, he insisted, but I'm not going to be the reason your life falls apart. This is on you. The call ended abruptly, leaving me reeling. In that moment, I realized how alone I truly was. Jake had been my escape, my distraction. But now, I had no one. The days that followed felt like a blur. Tim and I existed in the same house, but it was as though an invisible wall separated us. He spoke to me only when necessary, and his words were clipped, devoid of warmth. I wanted to reach out, to try to repair what I'd broken, but I didn't know how. Every time I opened my mouth to say something, the words caught in my throat. One evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of his voice from the living room. He was on the phone, speaking softly but firmly. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tension in his tone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer, straining to hear. I don't know if I can ever forgive her, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She didn't just betray me, she shattered everything I thought I knew about us. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. This was my doing. I had turned our life upside down, and now I was faced with the consequences. A few days later, Tim approached me with a folder in his hands. He placed it on the table between us, his expression unreadable. What's this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Papers, he said simply, for the divorce. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. My chest tightened as I stared at the folder, unable to bring myself to open it. I don't want a divorce, I said, my voice trembling. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't get to decide that now. You made your choice when you decided to cheat. This is the consequence. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, the hurt in his eyes cutting me like a knife. Tim, please, I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make this right. He shook his head, his jaw. It's too late for that. I deserve better. In the days that followed, I felt like a ghost in my own home. Tim began packing his things, moving them methodically into boxes. Watching him dismantle the life we'd built together was excruciating. Every item he packed felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. One evening, as he loaded a box into his car, I couldn't hold back any longer. I ran after him, tears streaming down my face. "Don't do this," I pleaded. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy, start over. Please, just give me a chance." He turned to face me, his expression cold. "You had your chance, and you threw it away." With Tim gone, the silence in the house was deafening. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work and avoiding the places that reminded me of him, but no matter how busy I kept myself, the emptiness lingered. Jake had been true to his word, distancing himself completely. The texts stopped, the phone calls ceased, and I was left to face the wreckage of my choices alone. At first I resented him for it, but eventually I realized that he'd done me a favor. I needed to confront the mess I'd made, not escape it. One afternoon, I decided to visit a coffee shop where Tim and I had spent countless weekends together. As I sat by the window, staring at the familiar street, I saw him. He was walking hand in hand with a woman I didn't recognize. She was laughing at something he'd said, her face lit up with a smile. My chest tightened as I watched them. He looked happy. Happier than I'd seen him in years. A pang of jealousy shot through me, followed by a wave of guilt. He deserved happiness, even if it wasn't with me. As they disappeared down the street, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever feel that kind of joy again. Over the next few weeks, I began to take a hard look at myself. For so long, I'd blamed Tim for the cracks in our marriage, for the emptiness I felt. But the truth was, those cracks had always been there, inside me. I'd been searching for something to fill a void that no one else could fill. Not Tim, not Jake, only me. I started therapy, hoping to untangle the mess of emotions that had led me to this point. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wanted to give up, to sink back into the comfort of denial. But I kept going, determined to make sense of my mistakes. One evening, months later, I received a text from Tim. "I'd like to meet. There's something I need to say." My heart raced as I read the message. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I owed him the courtesy of hearing him out. We met at a park, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot as we walked side by side. He looked different, stronger, more confident. The sight of him stirred something in me, a mix of regret and admiration. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice steady, "about us, about everything that happened." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I hated you for what you did," he admitted. "But I've realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping me. It was only holding me back." Tears filled my eyes as I listened to him. "I'm not saying I forgive you," he continued, "but I'm moving on. I've found someone who makes me happy, and I hope someday you can find happiness." As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the one I deserved. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, to start over. After Tim walked away that evening, I sat on a park bench for what felt like hours, watching the world move around me. Couples strolled hand in hand, children played on the swings, and the breeze carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. It was a stark contrast to the storm inside me. His words played on a loop in my mind. It wasn't forgiveness, not really, but it was something. A chance to move forward, to let go of the guilt that had consumed me. But what did moving forward even look like? I didn't know where to begin. The house felt emptier than ever that night. Every room echoed with memories of the life Tim and I had shared. The laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments that once felt so normal but now seemed precious. I wandered aimlessly, stopping at the photos on the mantel. One caught my eye. The two of us on a hiking trip, smiling at the camera with the mountains stretching behind us. I traced my fingers over the glass, a lump forming in my throat. I had taken those moments for granted, thinking there would always be more, but life had a way of shifting in ways you never expected. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into therapy with renewed determination. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Claire, encouraged me to dig deeper into my patterns, to examine why I'd made the choices I had. At first, it was painful, like peeling back layers of skin to expose raw nerves. But slowly, I began to understand myself in ways I never had before. "Why did you feel invisible?" Claire asked during one session. I shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know. Tim was always so steady, predictable. I guess I wanted excitement, something different." Claire tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Do you think excitement and stability are mutually? The question lingered with me long after the session ended. I'd spent so much time blaming Tim for what I thought was missing, but maybe the problem wasn't him. Maybe it was me. I started making changes, small at first, but significant. I joined a local book club, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I signed up for a painting class, even though I hadn't held a brush since high school. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that had been buried beneath the roles I'd played: wife, coworker, friend. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself. One evening, as I was leaving the painting studio, I heard a familiar voice. "I thought that was you." I turned to see Jake standing a few feet away, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. My stomach tightened at the sight of him, a mix of anger and longing flooding my chest. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "I was just passing by," he said, offering a sheepish smile. "I didn't think I'd run into you." I crossed my arms, my heart racing. Why now? After months of silence, why was he here, standing in front of me as if nothing had happened? "You didn't think to check in when my life was falling apart?" I snapped. "But now you want to chat?" Jake's smile faltered, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know what to say," he admitted. "I thought it was best to give you space." "Space?" I let out a bitter laugh. "You mean abandon me. Let me deal with the fallout alone." He flinched, the guilt clear on his face. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have handled things differently." I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the hurt he'd caused, but standing there looking into his eyes, I realized I didn't have the energy for it. I'd spent so much time clinging to the past, to the pain, and it had only held me back. "It doesn't matter anymore," I said, my voice quieter. "I've moved on." Jake nodded, a flicker of regret passing over his face. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be happy." I didn't respond, and after a moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. This time, I didn't feel the ache of loss. Instead, I felt a sense of closure, like a door had finally been shut. The holidays came and went, and with them, the bittersweet ache of memories. Tim had always loved Christmas, decorating the tree, baking cookies, singing off-key carols in the kitchen. This year, I spent it alone, sipping hot cocoa by the fire and reflecting. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I had learned to sit with my emotions, to face the uncomfortable truths about myself, and in doing so, I'd begun to heal. A few months later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Tim. He was getting married to the woman I'd seen him with at the coffee shop. My hands trembled as I held the card, a swirl of emotions flooding my chest. Happiness for him, sadness for what we'd lost, and a quiet acceptance of the life he was building without me. I decided not to attend the wedding, knowing it would only stir up emotions I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I wrote him a letter, thanking him for the time we'd shared and wishing him happiness in his new life. It was my way of letting go, of acknowledging the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. By the time spring rolled around, I felt lighter, freer than I had in years. The guilt that had weighed me down was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I had learned to forgive myself, to see my mistakes not as defining, but as lessons. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll find love again, maybe I won't. But for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. Because I've learned that happiness doesn't come from someone else. It comes from within. Spring brought a renewed sense of purpose. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and with it came the realization that my life, though fractured, was still mine to rebuild. I had spent months reflecting, healing, and rediscovering pieces of myself that had long been neglected. Now it was time to step into the future. I threw myself into my new hobbies, finding solace in the routine of painting and the camaraderie of the book club. It wasn't just about keeping busy, it was about reclaiming parts of myself I'd forgotten. I made new friends, surrounded myself with people who saw me for who I was, not who I had been. One of those friends, Lauren, had a knack for pulling me out of my comfort zone. She was the type of person who could light up a room with her energy, and her zest for life was contagious. One afternoon, as we sat on her porch drinking iced tea, she turned to me with a mischievous grin. "You know what you need? A fresh start. Something completely out of your comfort zone." I laughed, shaking my head. "I think I've had enough excitement for a lifetime." "I'm serious," she insisted. "Take a trip. Go somewhere new. Just for you." The idea lingered in my mind long after I left her house. A fresh start. A chance to step away from the memories, the guilt, the weight of my past. Maybe Lauren was right. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. A month later, I found myself in a small coastal town, the salty breeze whipping through my hair as I stood on the edge of a rocky cliff. The ocean stretched out before me, endless and alive, its waves crashing against the shore in a symphony of motion. It was breathtaking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The town was quaint, with its cobblestone streets and colorful storefronts. I rented a small cottage by the beach, spending my days exploring and my nights curled up with a book by the fire. It was a simple life, but it was mine, and that made it beautiful. One afternoon, as I wandered through a local art gallery, I struck up a conversation with the owner, a woman named Evelyn. She was in her 60s, with a warm smile and an infectious passion for art. When I mentioned my interest in painting, her eyes lit up. "Why don't you bring some of your work by?" she suggested. "I'd love to see it." I hesitated, the familiar doubt creeping in. My work was amateur at best, a hobby, not something worth showing. But Evelyn's encouragement was genuine, and I found myself agreeing. A week later, I brought a few of my paintings to the gallery. Evelyn examined them carefully, her expression thoughtful. "These are lovely," she said finally, her smile wide. "You have a real talent." Her words were a balm to my soul, a reminder that I was capable of creating something beautiful even amidst the chaos of my life. As the weeks turned into months, I found a rhythm in the coastal town. I painted, I wrote. I spent hours walking along the beach, letting the sound of the waves soothe my restless mind. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a good one. And then, one day, everything changed. I was sitting at a cafe, sketching in my notebook, when a man approached my table. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a kind smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. I hesitated, unsure of what to say, but there was something disarming about him, something that put me at ease. "Sure," I said finally. His name was Daniel, and he was a writer, in town researching for a novel. We spent hours talking, the conversation flowing easily like we'd known each other for years. He was warm and funny, with a quiet confidence that was both comforting and intriguing. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel and I grew closer. We shared dinners by the beach, long conversations about life and love and everything in between. He was different from anyone I'd ever known. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my cottage watching the sunset, he turned to me, his expression serious. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" I nodded, the weight of my past pressing down on me. "Yeah, more than I'd like to admit." He reached for my hand, his touch gentle. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you're ready to share, I'll listen." For the first time, I felt safe enough to open up. I told him about Tim, about Jake, about the choices that had led me here. He listened without judgment, his presence steady and unwavering. "You're stronger than you think," he said when I finished, his voice soft. "And you deserve happiness, no matter what you've been through." His words stayed with me long after that night. They were a reminder that my past didn't define me, that I could choose to build something new, something better. Daniel and I spent the summer together, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope. He didn't try to fix me or save me. He simply stood beside me as I navigated my way forward. And in doing so, he showed me that love didn't have to be a whirlwind of chaos. It could be steady, grounding, and deeply fulfilling. As the seasons changed, so did I. I still carried the scars of my past, but they no longer weighed me down. They were a part of my story, but they weren't the whole story. I had found peace, and in the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid, because I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The confrontation with Jake rattled me more than I cared to admit. His unexpected apologies stirred a cocktail of emotions I wasn't prepared for: anger, nostalgia, and the faintest trace of longing. But there was something else too: clarity. For the first time, I understood that his presence in my life had been as fleeting as it was toxic. Still, his words lingered, forcing me to confront the deeper truth about myself. A week after his call, I found myself staring at a blank canvas in my living room. My brushes lay untouched on the table, and the paint I'd set out had already begun to dry. My thoughts were confident and brimming with the kind of energy that seemed to electrify any room he walked into. In hindsight, I realized I'd been drawn to him not because of who he was, but because of who he made me feel I could be. Someone vibrant, desirable, and untethered. I wasn't sure I'd ever truly loved him, but I had loved the escape he offered. That evening, as the sky darkened and rain began to streak against the windows, I made a decision. If I was ever going to truly move on, I needed it to confront my past head on. And that meant talking to Tim again. Time, not for closure, but for accountability. I owed him more than the hollow apologies I'd offered before. The next day, I called Tim and asked if we could meet. There was a pause on the line, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then he agreed, his tone cautious but not cold. We arranged to meet at a park near his office, a neutral ground that felt less charged than our shared memories. I arrived early, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. The park was quiet, the paths lined with blooming flowers that seemed out of place against the storm clouds gathering overhead. I paced nervously, rehearsing what I would say, though no words felt adequate. Tim arrived a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but there was an ease in his posture that hadn't been there before. It struck me how much he'd changed since we last spoke. He seemed... "Thanks for meeting me," I said as he approached. He nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You said you needed to talk. What's on your mind?" I gestured toward a bench, and we sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the park filling the space between us. Finally, I took a deep breath in. Tim, I know I've said I'm sorry before, but I don't think I've ever really explained how much I regret what I did to you, to us. I wasn't just unfaithful. I was selfish. I blamed you for things that weren't your fault because it was easier than facing my own flaws. He listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the ground. Encouraged by his silence, I continued. I let myself believe that you weren't enough, but the truth is, I wasn't enough. I wasn't brave enough to tell you how I was feeling. I wasn't patient enough to work through the hard parts of our marriage. And instead of fixing what was broken, I ran from him. Looked up then, his eyes searching mine. Why now? He asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Why tell me all this now? Because I've spent the last year trying to understand myself, I admitted. And the more I learn, the more I realize how much I took from you without ever giving you the respect of the truth. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a heavy sigh and leaned back against the bench. I don't know if I can say I forgive you, he said finally. Not completely. But hearing this, it helps. It helps to know that you've thought about it, that you've tried to understand. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. I don't expect forgiveness, I said softly. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. We sat in silence for a while after that, the storm clouds above us darkening. Finally, Tim stood and offered me a small, almost hesitant smile. Take care of yourself, he said. You deserve to find peace. You too, I replied, watching as he walked away. That evening, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows as I sat in my living room, staring at the painting I'd started earlier. It wasn't much, just a rough sketch of a sunrise over the ocean. But as I picked up my brush and began to fill in the colors, for the first time, the weight of guilt began to lift. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could honor the lessons it had taught me. And as the rain fell outside, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever the future might hold. The storm of emotions following my meeting with Tim lingered, a blend of relief, guilt, and strange liberation. I had finally told him the truth, laid my mistakes bare, and in doing so, reclaimed a part of myself I had thought was lost. But closure with Tim wasn't the end of the story. There was another piece left unresolved, a confrontation I had been avoiding for far too long. His unexpected apology had reopened old wounds, forcing me to acknowledge the tangled web of emotions I had buried after our affair ended. But I couldn't move forward while that chapter remained open. I needed to confront him, not for closure, not for reconciliation, but to reclaim the power I had given him. I texted Jake one evening, my hands trembling as I typed out the message. We need to talk, face to face. His response came almost immediately. When and where? There was no hesitation in his words, no attempt to deflect. That, at least, gave me some small measure of confidence. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop tucked away in a corner of the city. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, and, for the first time, I was grateful for its anonymity. When I arrived, Jake was already there, seated at a corner table. He looked the same as I remembered, confident, composed, with an air of casual charm that had once drawn me in so effortlessly. But this time, I didn't feel the pull of his presence. Instead, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as though I were seeing him clearly for the first time. Hey, he said as I approached, standing to greet me. Hi, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. For a moment we sat in awkward silence, the tension between us almost palpable. Finally, Jake broke the ice. I'm glad you reached out, he said, his tone tentative. I've been meaning to talk to you again, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to hear from me. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. Why now, Jake? Why did you call after all this time? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. Because I've been carrying this guilt around, he admitted, about how things ended between us, about how I left you to deal with everything on your own. It wasn't right. I let his words hang in the air for a moment before responding. No, it wasn't. You walked away when things got hard, Jake. You left me to deal with the fallout while you disappeared. He flinched at my tone, the guilt evident in his eyes. You're right, he said softly. I was a coward. I didn't know how to handle it, so I ran. And I've regretted it ever since. His admission surprised me. Jake had always been so self-assured, so certain of his actions. Hearing him acknowledge his mistakes felt like a small victory, but it didn't erase the pain he had caused. You know what hurts the most? I said, my voice steady but firm. It wasn't just that you left. It was that I believed in you. I believed in us. And you proved that none of it was real. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his expression pain. I don't know what to say, he said finally. You're right to feel that way. I failed you. I failed both of us. For the first time in the conversation, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Jake hadn't just hurt me, he had hurt himself. He had built walls around his vulnerability, just as I had, and those walls had kept him from truly connecting with anyone, including me. I don't hate you, Jake, I said after a long pause. But I don't think I ever really loved you either. I think I loved the idea of you, the escape you offered. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. I loved the idea of you too, he admitted, and I think that's why we never worked. We were both running from something, and we used each other as an excuse not to face it. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. He was right. Our affair hadn't been about love or connection. It had been about avoidance, about filling the voids in our lives with something temporary, something fleeting. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. I think it's time we both stop running, I said, my voice steady. I don't regret learning from this, but I can't carry it with me anymore. Neither should you. Jake looked up at me, his expression a mix of sadness and gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. I nodded and walked away, my steps lighter than they had been in years. For the first time, I felt free of the weight I had carried since our affair ended. Jake was no longer a part of my story, at least not the part I was writing now. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city lights. The confrontation with Jake had been cathartic, but it also left me feeling raw, exposed. I realized how much of my identity I had tied to the men in my life. Tim, Jake, even Daniel. It was time to change that. I picked up a blank canvas and began to paint, letting the colors flow freely without worrying about form or structure. For hours I worked in silence, pouring everything I had into the piece. When I finally stepped back to look at it, I felt a swell of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The next day I called Evelyn and asked her if I could display the new piece at the gallery. She agreed immediately, her enthusiasm infectious. That's the one, she said after I sent her a photo of it. That's the piece that shows who you are now. As I hung the painting in the gallery later that week, I realized she was right. The piece wasn't just a reflection of my growth. It was a declaration, a reminder that I was no longer defined by my past, but by the choices I was making in the present. The weeks following my confrontation with Jake felt like a calm after the storm. For the first time in years, I felt as though I had laid the past to rest. The weight of guilt that had clung to me was lighter now, replaced by a quiet resolve to move forward. But moving forward wasn't just about healing, it was about rebuilding. Evelyn's gallery had become a sanctuary for me. I spent hours there, helping her curate new exhibits, meeting other artists, and slowly growing into my identity as a painter. My latest piece, the one I had poured my emotions into after the meeting with Jake, hung proudly on the wall, drawing attention from visitors and critics alike. Evelyn often caught me staring at it, a knowing smile on her face. "You're proud of it, aren't you?" she asked one day as we rearranged a display. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's the first thing I've done that feels honest. And that's why people love it," she said, "because they can feel that honesty." Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I navigated this new chapter of my life. For so long, I had hidden behind facades, projecting an image of myself that wasn't entirely true. Now, for the first time, I was learning to embrace who I was, flaws and all. One afternoon, as I worked in the gallery, I received an unexpected visitor. Tim's wife, Megan, walked through the doors, her eyes scanning the room before landing on me. My heart skipped a beat as I straightened up, unsure of what to expect. "Hi," she said, offering a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I replied, forcing myself to stay calm. "What brings you here?" She gestured toward my painting, her smile growing wider. "Tim told me about your work. He said I should come see it for myself." I wasn't sure how to respond. The idea of Tim talking about me to Megan felt strange, almost surreal. But there was no hostility in her tone, no trace of resentment. If anything, she seemed genuinely curious. "It's beautiful," she said, stepping closer to the painting. "There's so much emotion in it. You can feel it just by looking at it." "Thank you," I said softly, my throat tightening with unexpected emotion. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken word hanging between us. "Tim's happy, you know," she said. "He's moved on, but he still cares about you. He only wants good things for you." Her words hit me like a gentle wave, washing over the last remnants of guilt I'd been holding on to. "I'm glad he's happy," I said, my voice steady. "He deserves that." "So do you," she replied, her gaze steady. After Megan left, I sat alone in the gallery, letting her words sink in. Her kindness had been unexpected, but it also felt like a gift. A reminder that forgiveness wasn't just about the person receiving it. It was about the person giving it too. That evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by sketches and unfinished canvases. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly envision a future, unburdened by the past. A future where I wasn't defined by my mistakes, but by the choices I made moving forward. I pulled out a blank canvas and began to paint. This time I didn't think about what it would mean or how it would be received. I simply let the colors flow, my brush moving instinctively. As the hours passed, the image took shape. A sunrise over a calm ocean, the sky ablaze with warm hues of gold and orange. When I finally stepped back to look at the finished piece, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't just a painting, it was a reflection of where I was now, a place of calm, of hope, of possibility. In the days that followed, I made a decision. I would host a solo exhibit at the gallery, showcasing the journey I had been on through my art. It was a daunting idea, but Evelyn was thrilled, offering her full support. "This is your moment," she said. "Don't hold back." The night of the exhibit, the gallery was filled with people, friends, fellow artists, and even a few strangers who had come to see the work. As I stood near the entrance, greeting visitors and answering questions, I felt a swell of pride. This was my story, told in colors and shapes, and it was finally out in the world. Toward the end of the evening, Tim and Megan arrived. They approached me with warm smiles, and for the first time I didn't feel the pang of regret that had always accompanied seeing him. "You've done something amazing here," Tim said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Thank you," I said, my heart full. Megan chimed in, her smile bright. "We're so proud of you, really." As they moved on to explore the gallery, I watched them go, a sense of gratitude filling me. Tim had been a significant part of my story, but he wasn't the ending. He was a chapter inquiry, a chapter to write, a chapter to be, and ultimately helped me grow. By the time the exhibit ended, the gallery was quiet again, the guests gone, and the lights dimmed. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by my work, and felt a sense of fulfillment I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The night of the exhibit felt like a turning point, not just for my art, but for my life. As I stood in the quiet gallery, the lingering echoes of voices and footsteps fading into the stillness, I realized I had reached a place I never thought I would. Peace. The following morning, I returned to the gallery to help Evelyn clean up. She greeted me with a broad smile and a cup of coffee, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You should be proud, she said as we worked side by side. "Last night wasn't just about the art. It was about you showing the world who you are." Her words stayed with me throughout the day. The exhibit hadn't just been a showcase of my work. It had been a declaration, a statement that I had faced my mistakes, owned them, and emerged stronger on the other side. A few weeks later, I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, a sketchbook balanced on my knees, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tim. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. Megan and I were talking about it last night and we both agreed. You've come so far. I hope you keep going." I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart swelling with gratitude. Tim's words weren't just kind, they were a reminder of how far we had both come. We had found our way to different lives, but there was no animosity between us. Only respect and an unspoken acknowledgement of the roles we'd played in each other's journeys. "Thank you," I replied. "That means more than you know. Wishing you both all the happiness in the world." Over the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I continued to paint, throwing myself into my work with a passion I hadn't felt in years. Evelyn's gallery became a regular home for my pieces, and I even began to explore the idea of teaching art classes, passing on what I had learned to others who were looking to find themselves through creativity. One evening, as I walked along the beach, the sun dipping low on the horizon, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The mistakes, the heartbreak, the moments of doubt. They had all been part of the journey, and while I would never forget them, they no longer defined me. Not long after, I received a call from Danielle. I hadn't spoken in months, not since I'd left the coastal town to return to the city. His voice was warm, familiar, and it brought a smile to my face. "I heard about your exhibit," he said. "Sounds like it was incredible." "It was," I replied, leaning against the railing of my balcony. "But I'm still finding my way." "Aren't we all?" he said with a chuckle. I was thinking, maybe it's time for me to find my way back to the city. I miss it, and, if I'm being honest, I miss you. His words caught me off guard, but not in a bad way. Daniel had been a steady presence during one of the most turbulent times in my life, and while our paths had diverged, there was something comforting about the idea of reconnecting. "I'd like that," I said, a smile tugging at my lips. "Let me know when you're back in town." In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I fell back into an easy rhythm. Our conversations were filled with laughter and warmth, and for the first time I allowed myself to entertain the possibility of something more. But this time, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't running. I was simply letting things unfold. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Daniel turned to me, his expression serious. "You've changed," he said. "There's this strength about you now, a quiet confidence. It's beautiful." I smiled, his words resonating deeply. "I've been through a lot," I admitted, but I've learned that life isn't about running from your mistakes. It's about learning from them. And I think for the first time, I'm okay with where Daniel reached for my hand, his touch gentle. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. As I walked home that night, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for Daniel, but for everything. The pain, the mistakes, the growth. It had all led me here, to a life that was imperfect, but entirely my own. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that didn't scare me, because I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with strength, resilience, and a newfound sense of self-worth. As the months turned into years, I continued to build the life I had once thought impossible. My art flourished, my relationships deepened, and my sense of purpose grew stronger with each passing day. And while I would always carry the lessons of my past, they no longer weighed me down. They were simply part of my story, a story of loss and redemption, of mistakes and second chances, a story of a woman who had once lost her way but had found the courage to start over. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. Life had a way of lulling you into a sense of calm before tossing a curveball. Just as I was beginning to settle into this new version of myself, content, creative, and hopeful for the future, an unexpected letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from Tim. The sight of his handwriting sent a jolt through me. We'd already had our closure, hadn't we? What more could there be to say? I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope heavy in my hands, before finally tearing it open. Inside was a simple sheet of paper. "I need to see you. It's important." No explanations, no context, just a date and time set for the following weekend, and a location, our favorite cafe from years ago. My stomach churned with anxiety, but curiosity won out. I knew I had to go. The cafe was exactly as I remembered it. Its warm lighting and the hum of quiet conversation creating a sense of familiarity that was both comforting and unnerving. Tim was already there when I arrived, seated at a small table by the window. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming," he said, as I slid into the seat across. I nodded, my nerves on edge. "What's this about, Tim?" He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the coffee cup in front of him. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this," he began, his voice low, "but you deserve to know." And I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. The air between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. I braced myself, my mind racing with possibilities. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. He exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the table. "I found out something recently. About Jake." The mention of Jake's name was like a slap to the face, bringing back a flood of memories I'd worked so hard to bury. My heart pounded as I waited for him to continue. "He's been telling people things about you, about the affair, spinning it in a way that isn't fair. He's making it seem like it was all your idea, like you manipulated him." I felt the blood drain from my face. The anger bubbled up immediately, but so did the hurt. "Why would he do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why now?" Tim shook his head, his expression pain. "I don't know, but I thought you should hear it from me before it got back to you in some other way." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Tim reassured me that he and Megan didn't believe Jake's lies, but the damage had been done. The thought of my name being dragged through the mud, of people thinking I was solely to blame for what had happened, was unbearable. As I walked home, the weight of the revelation pressed down on me. Jake's betrayal felt like a fresh wound, reopening scars I thought had healed. But amidst the turmoil, a flicker of determination began to spark. I had come too far, grown too much, to let this define me. That evening, I called Jake. When he picked up, his voice was casual, almost smug, as if he'd been expecting my call. "I heard what you've been saying about me," I said, my tone icy. "I want to know why." There was a pause on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this," he said, his tone defensive. "People started asking questions and I don't know. It just got out of hand." "Got out of hand?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been lying about me, Jake, painting me as some kind of villain to save your own reputation. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" He sighed, and for a moment I thought he might apologize, but instead he doubled down. "You made your choices," he said coldly, "just like I made mine. If people want to talk, let them. It doesn't change anything." The call ended abruptly, leaving me seething with anger. Jake's indifference was infuriating, but it also solidified something in me. I was done letting him control the narrative. The next day, I went to Evelyn. She listened quietly as I told her everything, her face a mask of calm. "You have a platform now," she said when I finished, "through your art. If you want to set the record straight, do it on your terms. Don't let him take your voice." Her words lit a fire in me. That evening, I began working on a new piece, one that would tell the truth, not just about Jake, but about my entire journey. I poured every ounce of emotion into it, creating something raw, powerful, and deeply personal. When the painting was finished, I unveiled it at a special event at the gallery. It was titled Fragments, a swirling collage of broken shards coming together to form a vibrant, cohesive whole. Beneath the painting was a plaque with a short statement. "This is my story. Imperfect, messy, and human. I don't hide from my mistakes, but I also refuse to be defined by them. Growth is possible, even in the darkest moments." The response was overwhelming. Visitors flocked to the gallery, drawn by the honesty and vulnerability of the piece. I received messages from strangers thanking me for sharing my journey, for showing them that it was okay to stumble, as long as you kept moving forward. A few weeks later, I received a surprising email from Jake. It was short, but the tone was unmistakable. "Regret. I saw your painting," he wrote. "I didn't expect it to hit me the way it did. I'm sorry for everything, for what I said, for how I handled things. You deserved better." I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. My reply was brief but honest. "Thank you for saying that. I wish you well." In the end, the twists Jake had brought into my life became a catalyst for something greater. His betrayal forced me to confront my fears, to take control of my story, and to stand firmly in my truth. And through it all, I found strength I didn't know I had. As I stood in the gallery one evening, looking at fragments surrounded by other works that told pieces of my journey, I realized that I had turned my pain into something beautiful. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer held power over me. I had found my voice, and for that, I was endlessly grateful. As I stand here, looking back on the path I've traveled, I realize that life isn't defined by the mistakes we make, but by how we rise from them. My journey has been messy, painful, and at times unbearable, but through it all, I've found strength I didn't know I had. I learned to own my choices, to face the consequences, and to rebuild not just my life, but myself. Tim's forgiveness taught me the power of letting go, while Jake's betrayal showed me the importance of standing in my truth. Through my art, I discovered a voice I had long silenced, a voice that now speaks with honesty, vulnerability, and courage. And as I created fragments, I realized that every broken piece of my story had been necessary to make me whole. This chapter of my life has come to an end, but it's not the end of the story. It's a new beginning, a chance to move forward with clarity and purpose. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm ready. To those who've stumbled, to those who've lost their way, know this: it's never too late to start again. You are more than your mistakes. You are your resilience.